Well, we are lucky enough now to be joined by the leader of the Animal Welfare Party, Vanessa Hudson.
Hi.
Hello, thank you for joining us this afternoon on what is a very difficult day. I mean, should Geronimo be culled? Do you have any sympathy with the government's position on this?
I don't have sympathy with the government position on this. No, Geronimo shouldn't be killed. In fact, this is a perfect example of speciesism, everyday speciesism. So if Geronimo was a human being with TB, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Added on top of this, we have the issue of the failed science that's been tried to be used here to win this argument. So Geronimo, he passed the test in New Zealand before he came to the UK. Here in the UK, we use a different kind of testing in which he was primed beforehand with tuberculin, and then he was tested again. He tested positive. There is another test available, much more accurate, the phage PCR test. DEFRA are not allowing this test to be used, and if it were used, we strongly believe he would pass that test because, as Helen said, he doesn't have symptoms of TB. He'd likely pass that test and we could all move on. This is a huge waste of time on the part of DEFRA.
Absolutely. Well, like you say, I mean, he's probably been living with this TB, if he's had it, for 4 years. And normally the life expectancy of an animal that has it would be 6 months to a year. So I think clearly the evidence that's being used to execute him is flawed. And we need to use this PCR testing that's far more effective. Tom, what do you think?
Well, I think that the tests that have been levelled on Geronimo are incredibly accurate, and there have been 2 already. How many more tests are we really going to need before we need to accept that we need to take out this terrible case of TB? Because, of course, the reason why Geronimo needs to die is that if he doesn't, that TB could be passed on to herds of cattle, for example, to many other animals, and it could wreak much more damage. Is there not a utilitarian argument here that would actually save the lives of more animals, potentially, that you could understand?
If the tests he'd had and failed were accurate, then you may have a point there. However, the test that he's had twice is the bovine TB skin test, which we know is inaccurate. That's why Helen is asking for him to have the phage PCR test. It exists, it's there. We just need George Eustace to say, yes, he can have that. And that is the more accurate test. And that is the test that's been trialled at the moment. That is the test we'd like to see being used in cattle. And really, the reason that he's holding back on this, that he's refusing to give way, is because it calls into question the whole of the government's bovine TB control strategy over the past several years.
And what about a TB vaccination? So rather than culling animals, obviously in this case it would be Geronimo, there's also the badgers as well. Rather than culling vast amounts of animals, why is there not any sense or research being done into a vaccine that we could use to protect animals and have to avoid this horrible situation where poor Geronimo faces execution and his poor owner, you know, is spending hundreds of thousands of pounds in court to try and save his life?
Well, yes, there is a huge amount of research being done into vaccination against TB, and the research so far shows that that is positive and a better approach than our current approach, which is to identify TB. And at the moment, what we've got here in the UK is that we've been culling badgers. We've been making badgers a scapegoat, when actually the skin test that's been used for TB in cattle, we know it's not very accurate. Sometimes cattle pass that test and continue to circulate in their herd, continue to be sold and bought and move around the country. That is one way that TB may be being spread across the UK. Meanwhile, badgers are being made the scapegoat, and we're issuing new licenses to cull badgers, which is not acceptable. It's been a failed strategy. You know, we've culled these badgers, but we haven't controlled TB. That's why we have to look again at the evidence. And that's what George Eustace and DEFRA are not doing. They're not looking at the evidence, and they're not applying correct science.
Saying that this test is inaccurate, as if that carries some weight. There's obviously a reason why this government has been using this test, why it's the standard test to have been used, and why many alpacas and other animals that use the test do not have a false positive, as you allege has happened in this case. Why is it that this one particular alpaca is so different from all those that have gone before? Why do we have to apply different rules to this particular alpaca? I put it to you that it's just because it's got a relatable name.
I think think it's nothing to do with the name, actually, but I mean, the name helps the public to understand the story. So that's useful for us to kind of see animals on the same level as humans. Otherwise, we're being speciesist. But no, it's about the test itself. What happened to Geronimo hasn't happened to any other alpaca. He was primed before the test. So he was primed with an ingredient before the test, which made him likely to test positive. And then when the second test was done, he was primed again before the test. It's science that doesn't make sense. And that's why Helen has been calling for him to have a different test, the phage PCR test. There is no good answer as to why he can't have that test.
I can't help notice you used the term speciesist. Is this implying that you think that all species should be sort of treated at the same level?
Yes, because otherwise we're being speciesist. So speciesism has no more place in modern society than racism or sexism. You can't discriminate against a living being on the basis of their species. And this is discriminatory.
Does this not undermine your entire argument, though? If you're saying that no animal should be treated any differently from any human, then even if this alpaca fails its third test that you're calling for, you still wouldn't want it to be culled, just as you wouldn't want a human to be culled.
I think then we'd be looking at other ways of making sure Geronimo didn't spread TB. But even now, Geronimo is being kept in isolation.
Put it on a house arrest.
He could be in a
He's already been kept in isolation. I think speciesism is useful for us to to understand our actions, whether we are acting morally and ethically or not. And for us to apply a framework of speciesism, are we prioritizing our species and viewing other species differently than our own? That's useful for us to understand whether our actions are acceptable to ourselves, whether this is how we want to show up in the world,
But surely,
being the society that we are.
Surely every species is speciesist. A lion's speciesist against the gazelles that they chase. I mean, surely by using this term speciesist, you're accepting that humans are, if anything, in a hierarchy above the rest of animals because we're able to use such terms.
No, we have the capacity to decide whether our actions are how we want to show up in the world. So do we want to treat other animals differently than we treat ourselves? Now, many of us don't. You may not. I can't make a choice for you, but I can speak for lots of people who say the time is right for us to look at our own actions, decide whether we're proud of the way we're behaving, decide whether this fits and serves us in this century. And I would say a lot of us don't. We're not proud of the way we're behaving. Look at where it's led to today with the launch of the IPC report. Actually, our speciesism has led us to a point of moral crisis, biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, and health crisis. It's time for us to look at ourselves right now.
Vanessa, just to avoid kind of future cases of other Geronimos, what could we do to safeguard? So what can we do to keep Geronimo from infecting other alpacas or other wildlife, other bovine species nearby? I mean, do we have to isolate him? Like, what kind of practical things could his owner do to reassure DEFRA and the rest of the UK that we are containing Geronimo's suspected TB?
Well, Geronimo's already been kept in isolation. So she's already taken the measures she can take to absolutely make sure that if he did have TB, he's not spreading it anywhere else. He's kept in isolation. But what she wants now is the phage PCR test. Why can't he have it? That's the question.